Beth Pearson, the woman who refused to disappear. She was the steady hand in a storm no one saw coming, the one who held the family together, even as her own dreams quietly slipped away. But when life pushed her to the edge, Beth Pearson didn't break. She burned brighter through love, sacrifice, and a choice that would change everything. This is the story of a woman who refused to be just a background character in her own life. Welcome to ELIZA'S Stories. We hope you have a relaxing time enjoying our story. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like, share, and subscribe. Thank you. In the quiet town of Millbrook, Connecticut, winter had settled like a heavy blanket over the Hayes household. Eleanor Hayes stood at the frost-covered window, watching snowflakes dance in the amber glow of the street lamp. Her breath fogged the glass as she pressed her palm against the cold surface, thinking of her husband somewhere far away on a battlefield she could barely imagine. The house felt too large and too small all at once. Too large because Thomas's absence echoed in every corner. Too small because 4 spirited daughters filled every remaining space with their dreams, arguments, and endless energy. Eleanor pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned back to face the chaos that was her daily reality. Grace. Elizabeth Hayes, if you don't come down this instant, your breakfast will be stone cold. Eleanor called up the narrow staircase. Her voice carried the perfect balance of authority and affection that only mothers seem to master. From upstairs came the sound of hurried footsteps and muffled protests about inspiration, striking at inconvenient moments. 20-year-old Grace had inherited her father's stubborn streak and her mother's fierce intelligence. She lived in a world of stories and dreams, often forgetting the mundane necessities of life, like eating and sleeping. Eleanor smiled despite herself, remembering how Thomas used to lose himself in his books the same way. "Mama, Grace is using all the ink again." 16-year-old Emma's voice pierced through the morning air like an arrow finding its target. The youngest Hayes daughter possessed a dramatic flair that could rival any stage actress, along with an unfortunate tendency toward selfishness that Eleanor worked tirelessly to correct. "There's plenty of ink for everyone, darling," Eleanor replied patiently, though she made a mental note to speak with Grace about sharing resources. In these difficult times, every penny counted, and ink was a luxury they could barely afford. 18-year-old Claire emerged from the kitchen, her golden hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. She moved with the grace of someone who had been born understanding the social expectations placed upon young ladies. "Mama, I've prepared the oatmeal, but we're nearly out of sugar," she said softly, her blue eyes reflecting the worry she tried so hard to hide. Eleanor's heart clenched at the premature responsibility in her second daughter's voice. Claire had stepped into the role of little mother without being asked, sacrificing her own youth to help keep their family together. "Thank you, my dear. We'll make do with honey today." The truth was, they were running low on everything. Thomas's modest salary as a chaplain barely stretched to cover their basic needs, and with him away serving the Union cause, Eleanor had been forced to take in sewing to make ends meet. Her fingers bore the permanent marks of countless needle pricks, small wounds that seemed insignificant compared to what her husband might be enduring. 19-year-old Sophie appeared in the doorway like a gentle ghost, her pale complexion made even more ethereal by the morning light streaming through the windows. She carried her beloved piano music clutched against her chest, as if the sheets of notation could shield her from the harsh realities of their world. "Good morning, Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the household commotion. Eleanor's heart always gave a small flutter of concern when she looked at Sophie. Her third daughter had always been delicate, but lately she seemed to be fading like a pressed flower, left too long in the sun. The winter cold seemed to settle in Sophie's chest and refused to leave, causing fits of coughing that kept the entire household awake at night. "How are you feeling today, my angel?" Eleanor asked, placing a gentle hand on Sophie's forehead. The skin felt warm, but not alarmingly so. Still, the worry that had taken permanent residence in Eleanor's chest tightened another notch. "I'm perfectly well, Mama. Don't fuss so," Sophie insisted with a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had inherited her mother's tendency to minimize her own suffering for the sake of others, a trait that both impressed and terrified Eleanor. Grace finally thundered down the stairs, her dark hair escaping from its braid in wild tendrils that seemed to mirror her untamed spirit. She clutched a handful of papers covered in her flowing handwriting, evidence of another late-night writing session. "I'm sorry I'm late, but I had the most wonderful idea for a story about a brave soldier who stories don't fill empty stomachs." "Grace," Eleanor interrupted gently but firmly. "Come, let's eat together as a family. Your tales can wait until after we've nourished our bodies." As the 5 women gathered around the small wooden table, Eleanor felt the familiar pang of incompleteness. Thomas's empty chair seemed to loom larger than all of them combined, a constant reminder of the sacrifice their family was making for a cause larger than themselves. She had stopped setting a place for him weeks ago, unable to bear the sight of his unused plate and cup. The oatmeal was thin, and the bread was day-old, but Eleanor had learned to be grateful for what they had, rather than mourn what they lacked. She watched her daughters eat with the hungry enthusiasm of youth, their conversations flowing from complaints about the cold to excited plans for Christmas, still weeks away. "I don't see why we can't have a proper Christmas tree this year," Emma declared, her voice carrying the petulant tone that never failed to set Eleanor's teeth on edge. "The Ashford family has a tree so tall it touches their parlor ceiling. The Ashford family also has a father who didn't choose to serve his country in its hour of need," Eleanor replied quietly, her voice carrying a steel that made Emma look down at her bowl with something approaching shame. Claire reached across the table to squeeze her mother's hand. "We don't need expensive decorations to make Christmas special. Mama, we have each other, and that's worth more than all the Ashford trees in the world." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's wisdom. Claire had developed an uncanny ability to sense when emotions were running high and step in with exactly the right words to restore peace. It was a gift that would serve her well as a wife and mother someday. Though Eleanor selfishly hoped that day was still far in the future, Sophie began to hum softly, a melody that seemed to wrap around the tension in the room and dissolve it like sugar in tea. Her voice was pure and sweet, with a quality that made even the most mundane moments feel touched by something divine. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, remembering nights when Thomas would play his violin while Sophie sang, filling their home with music that made poverty feel like a temporary inconvenience rather than a constant companion. "I have an idea," Grace announced suddenly, her eyes bright with the fervor that always accompanied her inspirations. "What if we each make gifts for Christmas instead of buying them? We could create something meaningful rather than simply purchasing something expensive." Emma's face scrunched in immediate disapproval. "Handmade gifts are what poor people give when they can't afford real presents." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Eleanor felt her maternal instincts rise like a protective lioness. But before she could speak, Claire's voice rang out clear and firm. "Emma Hayes, you should be ashamed of yourself. Mama works her fingers to the bone to provide for us, and you have the audacity to complain about handmade gifts. Some families don't have anything at all for Christmas." Emma's face flushed red, but whether from shame or anger, Eleanor couldn't tell. Her youngest daughter had always struggled with understanding their changed circumstances. Before the war, when Thomas's position at the local college provided a comfortable, if not luxurious lifestyle, Emma had grown accustomed to small privileges that now seemed impossibly extravagant. "Girls," Eleanor said quietly, but her voice carried the authority that came from years of managing 4 strong-willed daughters. "We will not measure our worth by what we can purchase. The most precious gifts come from the heart, not from the store." She stood and began clearing the breakfast dishes, her movements efficient and practiced. As she worked, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Every decision, every word, every moment of patience or frustration would shape her daughter's understanding of the world and their place in it. The morning routine continued with its familiar choreography. Claire helped wash dishes while Grace disappeared back upstairs to continue writing. Sophie sat at the old piano in the parlor, her fingers finding comfort in melodies that seemed to flow directly from her soul to the keys. Emma, still sulking from the earlier reproof, made a show of organizing her art supplies with more noise than necessary. Eleanor watched her daughters navigate their individual pursuits and felt a complex mixture of pride and worry. Grace's writing showed real talent, but how could a woman make a living with words in a world that barely recognized female authors? Claire's gentle nature and domestic skills would make her an ideal wife, but Eleanor wanted her daughter to choose love rather than settle for security. Sophie's musical gifts were extraordinary, yet her fragile health made any kind of demanding career seem impossible. And Emma, with her artistic eye and dramatic temperament, possessed talents that could flourish if properly channeled. But her self-centered nature needed careful correction. A knock at the front door interrupted Eleanor's contemplations. She dried her hands on her apron and smoothed her hair before opening it to find Mrs. Henderson from down the street, her face pinched with cold and something that might have been embarrassment. "Good morning, Eleanor," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carefully neutral. "I hope I'm not disturbing your family's morning." "Not at all, Margaret. Please come in from the cold." Eleanor stepped aside to let her neighbor enter, noting the way Mrs. Henderson's eyes darted around their modest entryway, taking in the signs of their reduced circumstances. "I wanted to speak with you about the Kowalski family," Mrs. Henderson began, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "You know they live in that terrible little shack near the railroad tracks. I heard from Mrs. Peterson that they have no food for Christmas dinner, and the children don't even have proper winter coats." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised by the news. The Kowalski family had arrived from Poland just before the war began, and Mr. Kowalski's limited English had made finding steady work nearly impossible. She had often seen Mrs. Kowalski at the market, carefully counting pennies before making the most modest purchases. "I was thinking," Mrs. Henderson continued, "that perhaps some of the more fortunate families in the neighborhood might contribute to a Christmas basket for them. Of course, I understand if your current situation makes such charity difficult." The implication hung in the air between them. Everyone in Millbrook knew that the Hayes family had fallen on hard times. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm with a flush that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We would be honored to contribute," Eleanor said firmly, her voice carrying no trace of the uncertainty that fluttered in her chest. They had so little themselves, but the Kowalskis had even less. "Let me see what we can manage." After Mrs. Henderson left with promises to return later in the week, Eleanor stood in her hallway and wondered how she would make good on her commitment. Their pantry held barely enough to feed their own family through the week, and their more modest savings had dwindled to nearly nothing. Grace appeared at the top of the stairs, having obviously overheard the conversation. "Mama, are we really going to give food to the Kowalski family when we barely have enough for ourselves?" Eleanor looked up at her eldest daughter, seeing Thomas's questioning intelligence in Grace's dark eyes. This was one of those moments that would shape not just their immediate future, but the kind of woman Grace would become. "Come down here, dear. I think it's time we had a family meeting." Within minutes, all 4 girls had gathered in the parlor, their faces showing varying degrees of curiosity and concern. Eleanor settled into Thomas's chair, feeling the weight of his absence more acutely than ever. How she wished she could consult with him about these decisions that seemed to grow more complex with each passing day. "Girls, I need to share something important with you," Eleanor began, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "Mrs. Henderson has asked us to contribute to a Christmas basket for the Kowalski family. They are facing even greater hardships than we are." Emma immediately bristled with indignation. "But Mama, we don't have extra food to give away. We're barely managing as it is." "Emma makes a valid point," Claire said carefully, ever the diplomatic peacemaker. "How can we help others when we ourselves are struggling?" Eleanor had expected these reactions, but she also saw something else in her daughters' faces. Sophie's expression showed immediate compassion, her gentle heart already reaching out to a family she barely knew. Grace's eyes held the calculating look she wore when working through a complex plot problem, as if she were trying to understand the moral mathematics of the situation. "Let me tell you about something that happened when I was your age," Eleanor said, settling back in her chair. "My own mother faced a similar choice during a particularly harsh winter. Our neighbors, the O'Brien family, had lost their farm to creditors and were living in a single room above the blacksmith's shop." The girls leaned forward unconsciously, drawn by the promise of a story from their mother's mysterious past. Eleanor so rarely spoke about her childhood, focusing instead on their present and future. "We didn't have much ourselves," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the cadence of memory. "Your grandfather's business was struggling, and your grandmother took in washing to make ends meet. But when Mrs. O'Brien came to our door, pale and thin from hunger, carrying her infant son who cried constantly from emptiness, your grandmother didn't hesitate." Eleanor paused, seeing her own mother's face as clearly as if 30 years had not passed. Margaret Walsh had been a woman of fierce convictions and unlimited compassion, traits she had passed down to her daughter, along with her green eyes and stubborn chin. She gathered everything we could spare, and several things we couldn't, Eleanor said with a soft smile. We ate thin soup for 2 weeks, but the O'Brien baby stopped crying, and Mrs. O'Brien's color returned. More importantly, I learned something that has guided me ever since. What did you learn, Mama? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I learned that generosity isn't about giving from our abundance. True generosity is about sharing what we need for ourselves with those who need it more. Anyone can give when they have plenty. The real test of character comes when giving requires sacrifice. Grace sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. So you're saying that because the Kowalskis have less than we do, we should share what little we have. I'm saying that we have a choice. Eleanor replied carefully. We can focus on our own needs and limitations, or we can focus on our ability to help others. Both perspectives are valid, but only one leads to the kind of people I hope you'll become. Claire reached over and took Emma's hand, a gesture that made Eleanor's heart swell with pride. What if we each contributed something small? Together, our small gifts might add up to something meaningful. I could give them my new sheet music, Sophie offered immediately. Mrs. Kowalski might enjoy learning to play some of these pieces. Emma jerked her hand away from Claire's grasp. Sheet music doesn't fill empty stomachs, Sophie. Besides, they probably don't even have a piano. The sharp words hung in the air, like icicles waiting to fall. Eleanor felt her patience begin to fray around the edges, but she forced herself to remain calm. Emma's selfishness was a character flaw that needed addressing, but public humiliation was rarely the most effective teaching tool. Emma, Eleanor said quietly, what do you think generosity means? Her youngest daughter's face flushed red again, a sure sign that she knew she had spoken out of turn. I suppose it means giving things to people who need them, and who decides what people need. Eleanor pressed gently. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly wishing she could disappear. I don't know. The people themselves, I guess. Exactly. Mrs. Kowalski might treasure Sophie's music more than we can imagine. Perhaps she played piano in Poland and hasn't touched the keys since leaving her homeland. Perhaps music reminds her of happier times and gives her hope for the future. Eleanor could see the wheels turning in Emma's mind as she processed this possibility. Her youngest daughter was not fundamentally unkind, but she had never been forced to consider perspectives beyond her own limited experience. I have some paints I could contribute, Emma said finally, her voice small but determined, and maybe some drawing paper. Grace clapped her hands together with delight. This is perfect. I could write them a story. Maybe translate it into Polish, if I can find someone to help me. Imagine how homesick they must feel, especially during the holidays. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion as she watched her daughters transform from reluctant participants into enthusiastic collaborators. This was exactly what Thomas would have hoped for, she thought. He had always believed that children learned best through example rather than lecture. What about you, Mama? Claire asked. What will you contribute to the basket? Eleanor considered the question seriously. Her sewing skills had become their family's lifeline, but perhaps she could spare a few hours to create something special for the Kowalski children. I think I'll make each of their little ones a warm hat and mittens. Winter is hard enough when you're well-fed and comfortable, but that will take hours, Grace protested. You're already working so much, and your hands are so tired at night. The concern in her daughter's voice both touched and worried Eleanor. Grace was becoming too aware of their family's struggles, taking on emotional burdens that should remain with the adults. Tired hands are a small price to pay for warm children, Eleanor replied simply. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Eleanor watched her daughters channel their energy into preparation for their charitable mission. Grace disappeared upstairs with an armload of books, determined to research Polish customs and perhaps learn a few basic phrases. Claire began taking inventory of their pantry, calculating what they could reasonably spare without leaving their own family hungry. Sophie sat at the piano, but instead of playing her usual pieces, she worked through simple melodies that children might enjoy singing. Her cough had worsened throughout the day, but she refused Eleanor's suggestions to rest, insisting that music was the best medicine for any ailment. Emma spread her art supplies across the dining room table, creating colorful pictures that she announced were for decorating their house, so it feels more cheerful. Eleanor was impressed by both the quality of Emma's artwork and the thoughtfulness behind the gesture. As evening approached and the December darkness settled over Millbrook, Eleanor lit the oil lamps and prepared their simple dinner. The house felt different somehow, charged with purpose and possibility, in a way it hadn't since Thomas's departure. "Mama," Claire said as she helped serve the modest meal of bread and vegetable soup, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about generosity requiring sacrifice." Eleanor paused in her task of ladling soup into bowls. "What about it?" "Dear, I think I understand now why Papa chose to serve as a chaplain. Instead of staying home where it was safe, he's making a sacrifice to help people he doesn't even know, just like we're doing for the Kowalskis." The simple observation hit Eleanor with unexpected force. She had spent so many nights angry at Thomas for leaving them to struggle alone, questioning whether his sense of duty was worth the hardship it imposed on his family. But Claire was right. Thomas's service was an extension of the same values they were teaching their daughters through this small act of neighborhood charity. "Your father is a good man," Eleanor said softly, her voice thick with emotions she had been trying to suppress for months. "Sometimes good people have to make difficult choices." Grace looked up from her soup with sudden interest. "Do you think Papa is helping families wherever he is? Maybe there are soldiers who are homesick like the Kowalskis, and Papa is giving them comfort." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined Thomas offering spiritual counsel to young men far from their own families. Perhaps her sacrifice and his sacrifice were part of the same larger purpose, threads in a tapestry of service that stretched far beyond their small Connecticut town. "I'm sure he is." "Grace, your father has always believed that caring for others is the highest calling a person can have." As they finished their meal and prepared for bed, Eleanor reflected on the unexpected turns the day had taken. What had begun as a routine morning had evolved into something approaching revelation. Her daughters were learning lessons about compassion and sacrifice that no formal education could provide, and she was rediscovering truths about her husband that distance and hardship had temporarily obscured. Later that night, after the girls had gone to sleep, Eleanor sat by the dying fire and began working on the first of several small knit hats. Her fingers moved automatically through the familiar motions, while her mind wandered to Thomas, somewhere under strange stars, perhaps thinking of them as they were thinking of him. The wool was soft and warm in her hands, transformed from raw material into something that would provide comfort and protection. It seemed like a metaphor for motherhood itself, taking the rough experiences of daily life and somehow weaving them into something that would shelter and sustain the people she loved most in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to shape her daughter's understanding of what it meant to live with purpose and compassion. But tonight, Eleanor Hayes felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that love expressed through sacrifice was perhaps the greatest gift any mother could give her children. The fire crackled softly in the grate, and outside, snow began to fall again, covering Millbrook in a blanket of pristine white that made even the humblest homes look touched by magic. The first hints of spring arrived in Millbrook like a whispered promise, bringing with them changes that would test every lesson Eleanor Hayes had tried to instill in her daughters. March winds rattled the windows of their modest home, carrying the scent of melting snow and the distant sound of returning birds. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, watching Grace pace back and forth in their small garden, gesticulating wildly as she worked through some literary problem that existed only in her imagination. At 20, Grace had developed an intensity that both thrilled and worried her mother. Her eldest daughter possessed a fire that seemed to burn brighter with each passing day, fueled by dreams that stretched far beyond the boundaries of their quiet Connecticut town. Eleanor had found manuscripts hidden throughout the house under Grace's mattress, tucked between piano sheets, even folded carefully inside the family Bible. Each story revealed a mind that refused to be contained by conventional expectations. "Mama, there's a young man at the door asking for Grace," Claire announced from the hallway, her voice carrying a note of curiosity that made Eleanor's maternal instincts sharpen. In the months since Christmas, several local boys had found excuses to visit the Hayes household, drawn by Grace's unconventional beauty and fierce intelligence. Most had been discouraged by her complete indifference to their romantic overtures. Eleanor dried her hands on her apron and made her way to the front door, where she found a tall, well-dressed young man with sandy hair and kind eyes that reminded her achingly of Thomas at that age. He stood with his hat in his hands, the picture of nervous respectability. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hayes. I'm Theodore Lawson, but most people call me Teddy. I live with my grandfather just over on Maple Street." His voice carried the refined accent of good education and better breeding, but there was something appealingly genuine in his manner that immediately put Eleanor at ease. She had heard of the Lawsons. Of course, old Mr. James Lawson was one of Millbrook's most respected citizens, having made his fortune in shipping before retiring to a life of books and philanthropy. The grandson was said to be equally intelligent, but far more approachable than his sometimes intimidating grandfather. "How can I help you, Mr. Lawson?" Eleanor asked, though she strongly suspected she already knew the answer. "I was hoping to speak with Miss Grace, if she's available. We met at the library last week, and she mentioned that she was working on a novel. I'm something of a writer myself, and I thought perhaps we might discuss our mutual interests." Eleanor glanced toward the garden, where Grace continued her animated pacing, completely oblivious to their visitor. Her daughter's hair had escaped its pins and flew around her face like a dark banner, and her dress bore grass stains from where she had undoubtedly thrown herself down to scribble notes whenever inspiration struck. "Grace," Eleanor called, her voice carrying easily across the small yard. "You have a visitor." Grace looked up with the startled expression of someone being pulled from a dream into harsh reality. When she saw Teddy standing beside her mother, her face flushed with what Eleanor hoped was pleasure rather than irritation. Grace had little patience for social conventions when she was in the grip of creative fervor. "Mr. Lawson," Grace said as she approached, making a half-hearted attempt to smooth her wayward hair. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon. I hope I'm not intruding," Teddy replied, his eyes lighting up as he took in Grace's disheveled appearance. Unlike the other young men who had called, he seemed charmed rather than discouraged by her unconventional presentation. "I brought you something I thought you might enjoy." He produced a slim volume from his coat pocket, and Eleanor could see Grace's eyes widen with genuine interest. Books were currency in their household, more valuable than gold or jewels. Thomas had instilled in all his daughters a reverence for the written word that bordered on the religious. "It's a collection of essays by Margaret Fuller," Teddy explained, offering the book to Grace with something approaching reverence. "She wrote about the intellectual equality of women and their right to pursue any career that calls to them. I thought you might find her arguments compelling." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. Margaret Fuller's writings were considered radical by many, challenging as they did the fundamental assumptions about women's roles in society. That this young man would not only read such material, but think to share it with Grace, suggested a progressive mindset that was both encouraging and potentially dangerous. Grace accepted the book as if it were made of spun gold, her fingers tracing the title with obvious reverence. "I've wanted to read this for months, but the library's copy has been constantly borrowed." "Thank you, Mr. Lawson. This is incredibly thoughtful. Please call me Teddy, and perhaps you'd allow me to hear your thoughts on Fuller's ideas when you've had a chance to read them. I find that discussing challenging concepts with someone of equal intelligence always deepens my understanding." Eleanor watched the exchange with a mixture of maternal pride and growing concern. Grace was clearly enchanted by both the gift and the giver, her usual wariness around potential suitors completely absent. Teddy Lawson seemed like a genuinely good young man, but Eleanor had lived long enough to know that good intentions could still lead to heartbreak if the timing wasn't right. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Eleanor found herself offering, despite her reservations. Grace shot her a grateful look that confirmed her daughter's interest in prolonging the visit. "I would be honored, Mrs. Hayes," Teddy replied with a slight bow that managed to be respectful rather than ostentatious. As they settled in the parlor, Eleanor noticed how Teddy's presence seemed to energize the entire household. Sophie emerged from her morning practice session with more color in her cheeks than Eleanor had seen in weeks. Clearly delighted by the prospect of company, Claire bustled about serving tea and arranging the modest refreshments they could offer. Her natural hostess instincts in full display. Even Emma appeared, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar masculine laughter. At 17, she had developed a keen interest in young men, though her approach was far more calculated than Grace's unconscious charm. Emma positioned herself where the afternoon light would catch the gold highlights in her hair and assumed the pose she had been practicing in front of her mirror. "Are you an artist as well, Mr. Lawson?" Emma asked, with the kind of smile that had reduced several local boys to stammering confusion. "I find that creative souls often recognize each other across various disciplines." Eleanor bit back a smile at her youngest daughter's theatrical performance. Emma's artistic pretensions were real enough, but her tendency to use them as tools of flirtation was purely calculated. Teddy, however, seemed immune to Emma's charms, his attention focused entirely on Grace. "I dabble in writing, Miss Emma, but I suspect your sister has far more natural talent than I do," Teddy replied diplomatically. "I understand you're quite accomplished with watercolors." Emma preened at the compliment, but Eleanor could see the slight deflation in her posture as she realized she was not going to be the center of attention. Her youngest daughter had yet to learn that genuine charm couldn't be manufactured or performed. "Grace has been writing stories since she could hold a pencil," Sophie offered quietly from her corner chair. "She used to tell us the most wonderful tales when we were small. We'd beg her for just one more chapter every night." "What sort of stories?" Teddy asked, turning to Grace with obvious interest. Grace shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny, her natural shyness at war with her desire to share her passion. "Oh, just silly adventures mostly. Nothing very sophisticated. I doubt anything you write could be called silly," Teddy said seriously. "Would you be willing to share something with me? I promise to be a constructive critic rather than a harsh judge." Eleanor watched her daughter wrestle with the decision. Grace had never shown her writing to anyone outside the family, claiming that her work wasn't ready for outside evaluation. The fact that she was even considering sharing with Teddy spoke volumes about the impression he had made. "I have a story about a young woman who disguises herself as a man to fight in the war," Grace said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She wants to find her father and bring him home safely." The parallels to their own situation were impossible to miss, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. Grace had been working through her feelings about Thomas's absence in the only way she knew how, through story. "That sounds fascinating," Teddy said with genuine enthusiasm. The psychological complexity of a character living such a dual existence must present incredible narrative opportunities. Grace's face lit up like sunrise breaking over the horizon. "Exactly. Most people think war stories should focus on battles and strategies, but I'm more interested in how conflict changes people on the inside. How do you maintain your identity when everything familiar has been stripped away?" Eleanor listened to her daughter articulate ideas that she had clearly been developing in solitude for months, impressed by both the sophistication of Grace's thinking and Teddy's ability to draw out her natural eloquence. This was what intellectual companionship looked like. She realized two minds meeting as equals and challenging each other to reach greater heights. The afternoon passed more quickly than Eleanor had expected. Teddy proved himself to be not just intelligent, but genuinely kind, asking thoughtful questions about each daughter's interests and accomplishments. He listened to Sophie play with obvious appreciation, praised Emma's artwork without condescension, and complimented Claire on the excellent tea service in a way that acknowledged her domestic skills without diminishing their value. Most importantly, he treated Grace as an intellectual equal, engaging with her ideas seriously and offering perspectives that clearly challenged and excited her. Eleanor could see her eldest daughter blooming under this kind of attention, like a flower finally receiving the precise amount of sunlight it needed to flourish. When Teddy finally took his leave, promising to return the following week to discuss Margaret Fuller's essays, Eleanor noticed that Grace stood at the window watching his departure until he had completely disappeared from view. "He seems like a very nice young man," Claire observed diplomatically as the family gathered in the kitchen to help prepare dinner. "He's absolutely perfect," Emma declared dramatically, though Eleanor suspected this enthusiasm had more to do with the romantic possibilities than any genuine assessment of Teddy's character. Grace, you simply must encourage his attentions. He's handsome, wealthy, and clearly smitten with you. Grace whirled around to face her youngest sister, her eyes flashing with indignation. I am not some prize to be won, Emma Hayes. If I choose to spend time with Teddy, it will be because I enjoy his company and conversation, not because he meets your criteria for an advantageous match. Girls, Eleanor interrupted before the disagreement could escalate into a full argument. Marriage is not a topic for light discussion. When and if Grace decides to consider such things, the choice will be entirely hers to make. But even as she spoke the words, Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of maternal worry. Grace was clearly attracted to Teddy Lawson, and he seemed equally captivated by her. While Eleanor approved of the young man's character and intelligence, she wondered if Grace was truly ready for the complications that romantic attachment would bring to her already complex life. That evening, after her daughters had gone to bed, Eleanor found herself thinking about the different paths that seemed to be opening before each of her girls. Grace's literary ambitions had always seemed like youthful dreams, but watching her interact with Teddy had made Eleanor realize that her eldest daughter possessed both the talent and the determination to pursue an unconventional career. The question was whether love would support those ambitions or complicate them beyond management. Claire, meanwhile, had been receiving regular visits from John Brooks, the young tutor who had been helping emigrant families in the neighborhood with their children's education. John was nothing like the flashy suitors who pursued other young women. He was quiet, serious, and possessed of a deep integrity that reminded Eleanor of her own husband. Claire seemed genuinely fond of him, and Eleanor suspected that an engagement announcement might not be far in the future. The prospect filled her with mixed emotions. Claire was only 19, certainly old enough to marry by conventional standards, but Eleanor remembered her own wedding day and the mixture of excitement and terror that had accompanied her transition from daughter to wife. Marriage changed everything, and not always in ways that young people anticipated. Sophie's situation worried Eleanor most of all. Her third daughter's health had continued to decline throughout the winter. Despite Eleanor's best efforts to provide nutritious food and warm shelter, the persistent cough had worsened, and Sophie's already delicate frame seemed to be growing more fragile with each passing week. Dr. Williams had prescribed rest and fresh air, treatments that were difficult to provide in their modest circumstances. Emma, at 17, was still largely focused on her own desires and ambitions. Her artistic talent was undeniable, but her self-centered nature needed careful management if she was going to develop into the kind of woman Eleanor hoped all her daughters would become. The arrival of spring and the prospect of more social opportunities would test Emma's character in ways that concerned her mother. A soft knock at the front door interrupted Eleanor's contemplations. It was nearly 9 o'clock, unusually late for visitors in Millbrook. Eleanor made her way to the entrance, wondering who could be calling at such an hour. Through the glass panels, she could see the silhouette of a woman holding what appeared to be a letter. Eleanor's heart immediately began racing. Official correspondence delivered at night rarely brought good news, especially during wartime. Mrs. Hayes, the woman on the doorstep, was Mrs. Pearson from the telegraph office, her face grave in the lamplight. I have a message for you. It came through this evening, and I thought you'd want it right away. Eleanor's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope, recognizing the official markings that indicated military correspondence. For a moment, she couldn't bring herself to break the seal, terrified of what news it might contain. Thank you, Mrs. Pearson, she managed to whisper, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. After the telegraph operator had departed, Eleanor stood alone in her hallway, holding Thomas's fate in her hands. She could hear the normal sounds of her household settling. For the night, Sophie's soft cough from upstairs, the creak of floorboard as Grace paced in her room, the whispered conversation between Claire and Emma as they prepared for bed. Whatever news this letter contained would change everything. Eleanor took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and carefully opened the envelope. The message was brief and formal. Chaplain Thomas Hayes wounded in action. Condition stable. Transport to Washington Hospital arranged. Further information to follow. Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, relief and fear warring in her chest. Thomas was alive, but wounded seriously enough to require hospital care. The word stable offered some comfort, but she knew enough about battlefield medicine to understand how quickly conditions could change. Mama, Grace appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by some instinct that told her something significant had happened. "What's wrong?" Eleanor looked up at her eldest daughter, seeing Thomas's eyes looking back at her with concern and love. How could she protect her girls from this new worry, while still preparing them for what might come? "Your father has been injured," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "He's alive and being cared for, but we don't know how serious his condition might be." Within minutes, all four daughters had gathered around her, their faces showing varying degrees of shock and fear. Eleanor felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, heavier now than ever before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them as she had met every other trial, with courage, faith, and an unshakable determination to protect the family Thomas had entrusted to her care. "What do we do now, Mama?" Claire asked, her voice small and uncertain. Eleanor reached out to gather her daughters close, drawing strength from their warmth and love. "Now we wait, we pray, and we take care of each other. That's what families do during difficult times." But even as she spoke words of comfort and reassurance, Eleanor's mind was already racing ahead to the practical challenges they would face. If Thomas's injuries were severe enough to require extended hospitalization, their already precarious financial situation would become desperate. If he was unable to return to his position as chaplain, they would need to find new sources of income. Most importantly, Eleanor realized that her daughter's childhood was officially ending. The protected world she had tried to create for them was about to be tested by realities that no amount of maternal love could shield them from. Grace's literary dreams, Claire's gentle romance, Sophie's musical aspirations, Emma's artistic ambitions, all of it would now be filtered through the lens of uncertainty and potential loss. As the girls finally returned to their beds, Eleanor remained in the parlor, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and conversations she had hoped to postpone for years. But tonight, she allowed herself a few moments of grief for the simpler life they were leaving behind. Spring had arrived in Millbrook, bringing with it the promise of renewal and growth. But it had also brought changes that would transform the Hayes family in ways they could never have anticipated. Eleanor Hayes squared her shoulders and prepared to meet whatever trials lay ahead, knowing that love and determination would have to be enough to see them through the storms that were surely coming. The last ember flickered and died, leaving the room in darkness. But Eleanor remained in her chair, planning and preparing for a future that had suddenly become far more uncertain than she had ever imagined possible. The Washington hospital smelled of carbolic acid and suffering, a sharp contrast to the gentle lavender sachets Eleanor used to freshen their home in Millbrook. She sat beside Thomas's narrow bed, her hand resting lightly on his bandaged arm, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, with the desperate attention of someone who had learned not to take such simple miracles for granted. 3 weeks had passed since the telegram arrived, and Eleanor had made the difficult journey to the capital with Claire, leaving Grace to manage the household and care for Sophie and Emma. Thomas was alive, conscious, and according to Dr. Morrison, likely to make a full recovery from the shrapnel wound to his shoulder. But the man lying in the hospital bed bore little resemblance to the robust chaplain who had kissed her goodbye 8 months earlier. "You're too thin," Thomas said softly, his voice carrying the hoarse quality that came from weeks of pain and medication. His brown eyes, once warm with constant humor, now held shadows that Eleanor suspected would never entirely fade. "Have you been eating properly?" Eleanor almost laughed at the question. Here was her husband, wounded in service to his country, lying in a hospital bed thousands of miles from home, and his first concern was whether she was taking care of herself. It was so quintessentially Thomas that she felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm fine, darling. It's you we need to worry about," she replied, adjusting his pillow with the gentle efficiency she had developed over weeks of hospital visits. "Dr. Morrison says you'll be able to travel home within the month, provided there are no complications." Thomas's face brightened considerably at this news. "Home," he repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. "I dream about our parlor, about Sophie's piano music floating through the house in the evenings. How are the girls managing?" Eleanor chose her words carefully. The letters from Grace had painted a picture of controlled chaos, Sophie's health continuing to decline. Emma growing increasingly rebellious under her eldest sister's authority, and Grace herself struggling to balance her writing ambitions with the practical demands of managing a household. Most concerning of all was the news that Teddy Lawson had become a daily visitor, clearly courting Grace with the kind of persistent devotion that usually led to engagement announcements. Grace has shown remarkable maturity, Eleanor began diplomatically. She's managing the household accounts and ensuring that Sophie receives proper care. Claire has been helping John Brooks with his tutoring work to bring in a small income. Thomas studied his wife's face with the perceptive gaze that had made him an effective chaplain. What aren't you telling me? Eleanor, I can see the worry in your eyes. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, the sound of familiar voices in the hospital corridor made them both turn toward the door. Grace appeared first, her travel-worn dress and determined expression suggesting she had made the journey from Millbrook without stopping for rest or refreshment. Behind her came Claire, supporting a pale and trembling Sophie, who looked as if the trip had drained what little strength she possessed. "Papa," Grace cried, rushing to Thomas's bedside, with tears streaming down her face. "We came as soon as we received Mama's letter, saying you were well enough for visitors." Thomas struggled to sit up straighter, his face lighting with joy, despite the obvious pain the movement caused. "My dear girls, you shouldn't have made such a difficult journey. The expense doesn't matter," Claire interrupted gently, settling Sophie into the room's single chair before moving to kiss her father's forehead. "Mr. Lawson insisted on providing transportation when Grace told him about your condition. He said it was the least he could do for our family." Eleanor noticed the way Grace's cheeks flushed at the mention of Teddy's name, confirming her suspicions about the young man's growing importance in her daughter's life. The fact that he had paid for their travel expenses spoke well of his generosity, but it also suggested a level of involvement in their family affairs that moved beyond casual courtship. "Where is Emma?" Thomas asked, looking toward the door as if expecting his youngest daughter to appear at any moment. The silence that followed his question was telling. Grace and Claire exchanged a look that spoke of recent conflicts and difficult decisions. Sophie, who had been quiet since their arrival, began coughing a harsh, rattling sound that made Eleanor's maternal instincts flare with alarm. "Emma chose to remain in Millbrook," Grace said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "She felt that someone should maintain the household while we were all away." Thomas's expression suggested he understood there was more to the story, but before he could pursue the matter further, Sophie's coughing fit intensified. Eleanor immediately moved to her daughter's side, noting the flush of fever in Sophie's pale cheeks and the way she seemed to struggle for each breath. "Sophie, darling, when did this get worse?" Eleanor asked, pressing her palm to her daughter's burning forehead. "It's nothing, Mama," Sophie whispered between coughs. "Just the excitement of seeing Papa again. I'll be fine in a moment." But Eleanor could see that her third daughter was anything but fine. The journey from Connecticut had clearly been too much for Sophie's fragile constitution, and the stress of their family's recent trials seemed to have accelerated whatever illness had been slowly consuming her strength. "Dr. Morrison needs to examine her," Eleanor said firmly, moving toward the door to summon medical assistance. "Claire, help Sophie lie down on that cot by the window." As Eleanor hurried through the hospital corridors in search of the doctor, her mind raced with fear and guilt. She had been so focused on Thomas's recovery that she had perhaps not given sufficient attention to Sophie's declining health. The letters from home had mentioned the persistent cough, but Eleanor had assumed it was nothing more than a stubborn cold that would resolve itself with warmer weather. Dr. Morrison, a kindly man in his 50s, with prematurely gray hair and gentle hands, followed Eleanor back to Thomas's room with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned that medical crises rarely benefited from panic. He examined Sophie thoroughly while the rest of the family watched with barely concealed anxiety. "How long has she had this cough?" Dr. Morrison asked as he placed his stethoscope back in his medical bag. "Since winter," Eleanor replied, her voice tight with worry. It seemed to improve briefly in early spring, but then it returned worse than before. The doctor's expression remained carefully neutral, but Eleanor caught the concerned glance he exchanged with Thomas. Whatever Dr. Morrison was thinking, it clearly wasn't reassuring. "I'd like to keep Miss Sophie here for observation," he said finally. "Her lungs show signs of significant inflammation, and that fever concerns me. With proper rest and treatment, she should improve, but I want to monitor her condition closely. Eleanor felt the world shift slightly off its axis. The prospect of leaving Sophie in a hospital hundreds of miles from home seemed impossible, but the alternative, attempting to transport her back to Millbrook in her current condition, might be even more dangerous. I'll stay with her, Eleanor decided immediately. Thomas is nearly well enough to travel, and the girls can manage at home for a few more weeks. Mama, no, Grace protested. You've already been away from home for nearly a month. The household needs you, and Emma... She stopped abruptly, clearly reluctant to voice whatever concerns she harbored about their youngest sister. Thomas reached for Eleanor's hand from his hospital bed, his grip surprisingly strong, despite his recent ordeal. What happened with Emma? He asked quietly, his chaplain's intuition clearly sensing the undercurrents of family tension. Claire and Grace exchanged another loaded look, before Grace squared her shoulders and prepared to deliver what was obviously unwelcome news. Emma has been spending time with some of the local young men who have questionable reputations. When I tried to discuss appropriate behavior with her, she accused me of being jealous and tyrannical. Eleanor felt a familiar stab of maternal frustration. Emma's self-centered nature and dramatic tendencies had always made her the most challenging of the Hayes daughters. But Eleanor had hoped that their recent trials might have fostered some maturity in her youngest child. There's more, Claire added reluctantly. She's been neglecting her household duties and spending money we don't have on art supplies and fashionable accessories. When Grace confronted her about the expenses, Emma declared that she was nearly 18 and old enough to make her own decisions about how to live her life. Thomas closed his eyes and released a long sigh that spoke of paternal disappointment and concern. And I suppose young Mr. Lawson has been witness to these family difficulties. Grace's flush deepened to crimson. Teddy has been nothing but supportive and understanding. He's helped mediate several arguments between Emma and me, and he's never made judgmental comments about our family's circumstances. Eleanor studied her eldest daughter carefully, noting the defensive tone that crept into Grace's voice whenever Teddy's name was mentioned. The young man's constant presence during their family crisis suggested a level of emotional intimacy that went well beyond casual friendship. Has Mr. Lawson made his intentions clear regarding your future together? Eleanor asked gently. The question hung in the air like morning mist, delicate and impossible to ignore. Grace's hands twisted in her lap as she struggled to find words for feelings that were clearly still developing. He's spoken about possibilities, Grace admitted finally, but I've told him that my writing must come first. I'm not ready to consider marriage when I haven't even determined whether I have genuine literary talent. Thomas smiled, despite his weakness and worry. That sounds like my practical daughter. Love should enhance your dreams, not replace them. But Teddy doesn't want to replace my dreams, Grace said quickly. He encourages my writing and treats my ambitions seriously. He's even suggested that I might find publishers in Boston or New York who would be interested in my work. Eleanor felt a flutter of concern at this revelation. While she appreciated Teddy's support of Grace's literary aspirations, the idea of her daughter pursuing publication in distant cities filled her with maternal anxiety. The literary world was notoriously difficult for women, and the social freedoms required for such a career could expose Grace to criticism and potential scandal. Sophie's coughing fit interrupted these uncomfortable contemplations, and Eleanor immediately refocused her attention on her sick daughter's needs. Whatever complicated emotions surrounded Grace's romantic situation would have to wait. Sophie's health was the immediate priority. I think we should all rest. Dr. Morrison suggested diplomatically, Miss Sophie needs quiet, and I suspect the rest of you are exhausted from your journey. Mrs. Hayes, there's a small room down the hall where family members can stay when they're caring for patients. As they arranged themselves for an uncomfortable night in the hospital, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how dramatically their lives had changed in just a few short months. Thomas's injury had forced them all to confront realities they had been able to ignore during his absence. Grace was no longer a dreamy girl playing with literary fantasies. She was a young woman making adult decisions about love and career. Claire's romance with John Brooks was progressing towards serious commitment. Sophie's illness had moved beyond the realm of minor childhood ailments into something that required genuine medical attention. Most troubling of all was Emma's apparent rebellion against the values and expectations that had shaped their family life. Eleanor had always known that her youngest daughter would be the most challenging to guide toward maturity, but she hadn't anticipated such direct defiance of family authority. Late that night, as Eleanor sat beside Sophie's hospital bed, listening to her daughter's labored breathing, Thomas appeared in the doorway. He was walking slowly and favoring his injured arm, but the determination in his posture reminded her of the man who had decided to serve as a chaplain despite the dangers involved. "You should be resting," Eleanor whispered as he settled into the chair beside her. "So should you," Thomas replied softly, "but I suspect neither of us will sleep much tonight." They sat together in the dim hospital room, drawing comfort from each other's presence after months of separation and uncertainty. Sophie's breathing gradually became less labored as the medication Dr. Morrison had prescribed began to take effect, and the crisis atmosphere of the evening settled into watchful vigil. "She's so fragile," Eleanor murmured, brushing a strand of hair away from Sophie's fevered face. "Sometimes I think she's too delicate for this harsh world." Thomas reached over to squeeze his wife's hand. "Sophie has a strength that isn't immediately visible. Her music brings joy and peace to everyone who hears it. That's a gift that the world desperately needs, especially now." Eleanor knew he was right, but maternal worry wasn't easily assuaged by philosophical observations. Sophie's apparent fragility had always concerned her, and now that concern was crystallizing into genuine fear for her daughter's future. "What are we going to do about Emma?" Eleanor asked, changing the subject to another source of anxiety. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, considering the question with the same careful deliberation he brought to all family matters. "Emma is at a difficult age, caught between childhood and adulthood. Perhaps she needs to make some mistakes in order to learn important lessons. But what if those mistakes have consequences that can't be undone?" Eleanor protested. "Her reputation, her future prospects, will depend more on her character than on any temporary rebellious phase." Thomas finished gently. "We've raised her with good values, Eleanor. Eventually, those lessons will take root, even if they're currently buried under teenage defiance." Eleanor wished she could share her husband's confidence, but Emma's self-centered nature had always worried her. Unlike her sisters, Emma seemed to lack the innate empathy that made moral lessons stick. She was capable of kindness when it served her purposes, but Eleanor had yet to see evidence of genuine selflessness in her youngest daughter's character. "And what about Grace?" Eleanor asked. "I think she's falling in love with young Mr. Lawson." Thomas smiled in the darkness. "Is that necessarily a problem? From what you've told me, he seems like a good young man with genuine affection for our daughter. But her writing, her dreams of independence, marriage changes everything for a woman. Even if Teddy supports her literary ambitions now, what happens when children come? When social expectations pressure her to abandon her career for domestic responsibilities?" Thomas was quiet again, and Eleanor knew he was thinking about the sacrifices she had made when they married. Eleanor had been an accomplished pianist before becoming a wife and mother, with genuine talent that might have led to a performance career under different circumstances. She had never regretted choosing family over music, but she sometimes wondered what path her life might have taken if societal expectations had been different. "Perhaps Grace's generation will have opportunities that weren't available to ours," Thomas said finally. "The world is changing, and women are beginning to demand roles beyond wife and mother. If Grace has the talent and determination to pursue a writing career, maybe she'll find ways to balance that with marriage and family." Eleanor hoped he was right, but she had lived long enough to understand how easily dreams could be subsumed by practical necessities. Love might seem like it could conquer all obstacles, but the daily realities of married life had a way of reshaping even the most optimistic plans. As dawn light began to filter through the hospital windows, Sophie stirred restlessly and opened her eyes. For a moment, she looked confused by her unfamiliar surroundings, but then her gaze settled on her parents, and a peaceful smile crossed her pale features. "Mama, Papa," she whispered, her voice hoarse but stronger than it had been the previous evening. "I feel much better. The medicine Dr. Morrison gave me helped tremendously." Eleanor felt a rush of relief so intense it left her lightheaded. Sophie's fever seemed to have broken during the night, and her breathing was noticeably easier. Whatever illness had been plaguing her daughter might finally be responding to proper medical treatment. "That's wonderful, darling," Eleanor said, pressing a gentle kiss to Sophie's forehead. but you must promise to rest and follow all of Dr. Morrison's instructions. We can't take any chances with your health." Sophie nodded obediently, but Eleanor could see the restless energy in her daughter's eyes that suggested she was already planning to resume normal activities as soon as possible. Sophie had inherited her father's sense of duty and her mother's tendency to minimize her own needs for the sake of others, traits that could be admirable but also dangerous when applied to matters of health. Later that morning, Dr. Morrison's examination confirmed Eleanor's hopeful assessment. Sophie's condition had improved dramatically overnight, though he cautioned that she would need several weeks of careful rest and medication to fully recover. "I believe she can travel home safely in a few days," the doctor told Eleanor privately, "but she'll need constant supervision and absolutely no exertion for at least a month. Her lungs are still inflamed, and any relapse could be quite serious." Eleanor nodded, already mentally reorganizing their household routines to accommodate Sophie's medical needs. It would mean additional expenses for medication and perhaps hiring help with the heavier household tasks, but Sophie's health was worth any sacrifice. As the Hayes family prepared for their eventual return to Millbrook, Eleanor reflected on the lessons this crisis had taught them all. Thomas's injury and Sophie's illness had forced them to confront their own mortality and the fragility of the life they had built together, but they had also discovered reserves of strength and love that might otherwise have remained untapped. Grace had revealed a maturity and capability that went far beyond her 20 years. Claire had shown remarkable courage in the face of family emergencies. Even Emma's rebellion, while concerning, demonstrated a spirit of independence that might eventually serve her well if properly channeled. Most importantly, Eleanor had been reminded that love, romantic, familial, and universal, was indeed the force that made all other sacrifices worthwhile. Whatever challenges lay ahead for their family, they would meet them together, drawing strength from the bonds that connected them across any distance or difficulty. The spring sun streaming through the hospital windows seemed to promise better days ahead, and for the first time in months, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that promise might actually be fulfilled. The autumn light filtering through the Hayes family parlor had a golden quality that seemed to transform even their modest furnishings into something approaching elegance. Eleanor sat in her favorite chair, her hands busy with mending, while her eyes followed Emma's restless pacing across the worn carpet. At 18, her youngest daughter had developed a grace that reminded Eleanor achingly of herself at that age, but Emma's beauty was complicated by a willfulness that seemed to grow stronger with each passing season. "I simply don't understand why you won't allow me to accept Mrs. Ashford's invitation to accompany her to New York," Emma declared, her voice carrying the dramatic inflection she had perfected through months of similar arguments. "Aunt May specifically requested that I come help her with her art collection, and it would provide invaluable experience for my own artistic development." Eleanor set down her sewing and studied her daughter's flushed face, noting the way Emma's hands gestured expressively as she made her case. In the 6 months since Thomas's return from the hospital, their family had settled into new rhythms that accommodated his slower recovery and Sophie's ongoing health concerns. But Emma had grown increasingly restless with what she viewed as the limitations of their quiet Connecticut life. "Emma, darling, Aunt May is elderly and quite set in her ways. Living as her companion in Boston would be far more restrictive than you imagine," Eleanor replied patiently, though she had made this argument countless times over the past weeks. "Besides, your education isn't complete, and there's much you could still learn here at home." Emma's eyes flashed with the kind of indignation that seemed to be her default response to any form of parental guidance. "What could I possibly learn in Millbrook that I couldn't learn better in a real city? Aunt May moves in circles of genuine artists and intellectuals. Here, I'm surrounded by provincial minds who think watercolor sketches of flowers represent the height of artistic achievement." The dismissive tone in Emma's voice made Eleanor's maternal patience begin to fray around the edges. Her youngest daughter's talent was undeniable, but her attitude toward their neighbors and circumstances suggested a level of arrogance that troubled Eleanor deeply. "Your father and I have sacrificed considerably to ensure that you girls receive proper educations and moral guidance," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying the steel that her daughters had learned to recognize as a warning. Perhaps it's time you considered what you might contribute to this family, rather than focusing solely on what it can provide for you. Before Emma could formulate what was sure to be an indignant response, the sound of familiar laughter from the garden drew both women's attention toward the window. Grace and Teddy were walking slowly among the late roses, their heads bent together in intense conversation. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the way her eldest daughter's face lit up when she looked at the young man who had become such a constant presence in their lives. At least Grace has found someone who appreciates her mind, Emma said with a sigh that carried more wistfulness than she probably intended to reveal. Teddy actually listens when she talks about her writing, and he encourages her ambitions instead of trying to diminish them. Eleanor felt a flutter of surprise at this unusually generous observation from her typically self-focused daughter. You approve of Mr. Lawson's courtship of your sister? Emma shrugged with the studied casualness that adolescents used when discussing topics that mattered more than they wanted to admit. Grace deserves someone who sees her as more than just a potential wife and mother. Teddy treats her like an intellectual equal, which is more than most young women can expect from their suitors. The mature insight in Emma's comment suggested that perhaps her youngest daughter was developing a deeper understanding of the world than Eleanor had given her credit for. Emma's rebellious phase might be evolving into something more substantial, a genuine questioning of societal expectations rather than simple teenage defiance. And what do you want for yourself, Emma? Eleanor asked gently. Beyond escaping the limitations of Millbrook, what kind of life do you hope to build? Emma stopped pacing and settled into the window seat, her expression growing thoughtful in a way that reminded Eleanor of the serious little girl Emma had been before adolescence complicated everything. I want to create something beautiful that will outlast me, she said finally. I want people to look at my paintings and feel the way I feel when I see a perfect sunset or watch light play across water. Is that foolish? Eleanor felt her heart soften at the vulnerability in her daughter's voice. Beneath Emma's dramatic posturing lay genuine artistic passion and a desire for meaning that Eleanor recognized and respected. The challenge was helping Emma find ways to pursue those dreams without sacrificing the values and relationships that would sustain her throughout her life. It's not foolish at all, my dear, Eleanor replied warmly. Art that moves people's hearts is one of humanity's greatest gifts. But remember that the most enduring beauty often comes from understanding and compassion, not just technical skill. Their conversation was interrupted by Sophie's approach from the kitchen, carrying a tea tray with the careful movements that had become necessary since her illness. At 19, Sophie remained delicate, but the crisis in Washington had marked a turning point in her recovery. Under Dr. Morrison's continued care and Eleanor's vigilant attention, Sophie had regained much of her strength, though she would always need to be cautious about overexertion. Grace and Teddy are discussing Margaret Fuller again, Sophie said with a gentle smile as she set down the tea service. I can hear them debating women's intellectual capacity from here. Grace gets so animated when she's arguing philosophical points. Eleanor poured tea for her daughters, noting the way Sophie's color had improved over the summer months. The music lessons Sophie had been giving to several local children had provided both modest income and a sense of purpose that seemed to contribute to her overall well-being. Sometimes Eleanor thought that meaningful work was the best medicine of all. Has Grace said anything about her future plans? Eleanor asked carefully. The question of Grace's relationship with Teddy had become increasingly pressing as their courtship entered its second year. Teddy's intentions seemed entirely honorable, and his support for Grace's literary ambitions was genuine. But Eleanor worried about the practical challenges of combining marriage with a writing career. Emma and Sophie exchanged a look that suggested they possessed information Eleanor did not. She's been corresponding with an editor in Boston, Sophie revealed quietly, someone Teddy introduced her to through his grandfather's connections. They're interested in publishing some of her stories in their literary magazine. Eleanor felt a complex mixture of pride and concern at this news. Grace's talent deserved recognition, but the literary world could be harsh and unforgiving, especially toward women who challenged conventional expectations. And what does she think about balancing such opportunities with Teddy's courtship? I think that's what they're discussing in the garden, Emma said with unusual tact. Teddy proposed last week, and Grace asked for time to consider her answer. The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She had suspected that an engagement was imminent, but knowing that Grace was wrestling with such a momentous decision without maternal guidance, left Eleanor feeling helpless and excluded. "Why didn't she come to me?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie reached over to squeeze her mother's hand. "Grace knows how much you worry about all of us. I think she wanted to work through her own feelings before involving the family in what she calls the most important decision of her life." Eleanor could understand Grace's reasoning, but it still stung to realize that her eldest daughter was navigating such crucial choices without seeking her counsel. When had Grace become so independent, so confident in her own judgment? Eleanor felt the bittersweet recognition that came with watching children grow into adults' pride in their capabilities, mixed with grief for the intimacy that was inevitably lost in the process. Thomas appeared in the parlor doorway, moving with the careful deliberation that remained a legacy of his war injury. His recovery had been more complete than Dr. Morrison had initially hoped, but he would never again possess the physical vigor that had once characterized his approach to life. Instead, he had developed a thoughtful quality that made his presence even more comforting than before. "The young people are having quite an intense discussion," he observed mildly, settling into his favorite chair with a slight wince that Eleanor pretended not to notice. "I suspect we may have some family news to discuss soon. The girls tell me that Teddy has proposed," Eleanor said, keeping her voice carefully neutral despite the emotions churning in her chest. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression reflecting the same complex feelings Eleanor was experiencing. "He spoke to me this morning, asking for permission to court Grace with serious intentions. I told him that the decision was entirely Grace's to make, but that he had our blessing if she chose to accept his proposal." Eleanor felt a flash of irritation that Thomas had conducted this conversation without consulting her, but she recognized the unfairness of her reaction. Thomas was simply following the social conventions that govern such matters, and his support for Grace's autonomy was entirely consistent with the values they had tried to instill in all their daughters. "What do you think she'll decide?" Emma asked, her voice betraying more anxiety than Eleanor had expected. Perhaps Emma was beginning to understand that Grace's choice would affect the entire family dynamic. "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that Grace will find a way to honor both her heart and her ambitions. She's inherited her mother's practical wisdom, along with her father's stubborn determination." As if summoned by their conversation, Grace and Teddy appeared at the parlor door, their faces flushed with emotion and autumn air. Grace's eyes were bright with tears, but Eleanor couldn't determine whether they were tears of joy or sorrow. "Mama, Papa," Grace began, her voice trembling slightly, "Teddy and I have something to tell you." Eleanor braced herself for whatever news was coming, drawing strength from Thomas's steady presence and the supportive gazes of Sophie and Emma. Whatever Grace had decided, their family would adapt and continue to love each other through any challenges that lay ahead. "I've accepted Teddy's proposal," Grace announced, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "But we've agreed to a long engagement that will allow me to pursue my writing career before we marry. Teddy has family connections in New York who can help me find publishers, and he's willing to wait until I've established myself as a writer." Eleanor felt relief flood through her chest. This was exactly the kind of compromise she had hoped Grace might negotiate, a solution that honored both love and ambition, without requiring her to sacrifice either one. "That's wonderful news, darling," Eleanor said, rising to embrace her daughter and future son-in-law. "We're so happy for both of you." Teddy's face lit up with gratitude and joy. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. I promise to support Grace's dreams in every way possible. Her talent deserves recognition, and I want to help her achieve everything she's capable of accomplishing." As the family gathered around the newly engaged couple, Eleanor found herself thinking about the cycles of love and growth that seemed to define human existence. Grace was embarking on the same journey that Eleanor had taken 25 years earlier, but with opportunities and support that hadn't existed for women of Eleanor's generation. Perhaps that was what parenthood ultimately meant, preparing children to live lives that were both similar to and different from their parents' experiences. Eleanor had given Grace the tools of compassion, determination, and moral courage. How Grace chose to use those tools would be entirely up to her. Later that evening, after Teddy had returned home and the excitement of the engagement announcement had settled into quiet family contentment, Eleanor found herself alone with Grace in the kitchen. They worked together, preparing tea and arranging leftover cake, moving in the synchronized rhythm that came from years of shared domestic routines. "Are you happy with my decision, Mama?" Grace asked suddenly, her voice carrying the vulnerability that always surprised Eleanor when it emerged from her confident eldest daughter. Eleanor paused in her task of washing teacups, considering how to articulate the complex emotions Grace's engagement had stirred. "I'm happy that you found someone who loves and respects you," she said finally, "and I'm proud that you found a way to pursue your dreams without abandoning them for conventional expectations. But you're worried about something," Grace observed with the perceptiveness that made her such a gifted writer. Eleanor smiled at her daughter's insight. "I suppose I'm worried about the same things every mother worries about when her daughter gets engaged. Will you be happy? Will your marriage enhance your life? Or complicate it beyond management? Will you remember to take care of yourself even when you're caring for others?" Grace set down the dish she had been drying and turned to face her mother directly. "I've watched you balance love and responsibility my entire life, Mama. You've shown me that it's possible to be devoted to family while still maintaining your own identity and values. If I can be half the woman you are, I'll consider my life a success." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's words. When had Grace developed such wisdom about the complexities of womanhood? When had she stopped being Eleanor's little girl and become her equal in understanding life's challenges? "The secret," Eleanor said softly, "is remembering that love multiplies when it's shared, rather than being diminished by division. The more people you care about, the more capacity for caring you discover within yourself." As they finished their domestic tasks and prepared to join the rest of the family in the parlor, Eleanor reflected on the changes the past 2 years had brought to their household. Thomas's injury and recovery had reminded them all of life's fragility and preciousness. Sophie's illness had taught them about resilience and the healing power of music and love. Grace's engagement represented hope for a future that honored both tradition and progress. Even Emma's restlessness, Eleanor realized, was part of her youngest daughter's journey toward understanding her place in the world. Emma's artistic ambitions and desire for independence weren't character flaws to be corrected, but natural impulses that needed guidance and channeling rather than suppression. The parlor was warm and bright when Eleanor and Grace rejoined their family, filled with the comfortable sounds of domestic happiness. Sophie playing gentle melodies on the piano, Thomas reading aloud from his evening newspaper, Emma sketching by lamplight while offering occasional commentary on the day's events. This was what Eleanor had fought to preserve throughout all their trials and changes. Not just the physical structure of their household, but the emotional bonds that made them more than just individuals sharing living space. They were a family, connected by love, shared values, and the kind of deep understanding that only came from weathering difficulties together. "Mama," Claire's voice called from the hallway. "John is here to escort me to the town meeting. We'll be back before 10. Eleanor smiled as she watched her second daughter appear in her best dress, radiant with happiness and the confidence that came from being genuinely loved. Claire and John's courtship had progressed steadily throughout the summer, and Eleanor suspected another engagement announcement might not be far in the future. As Claire Ed with her suitor, Eleanor settled into her chair and picked up her mending, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. Around her, her family pursued their individual interests, while remaining connected by the invisible bonds of affection and shared experience. The future stretched ahead of them, full of unknown challenges and opportunities. Grace would navigate the complexities of marriage and career. Sophie would continue building her strength while sharing her musical gifts with others. Emma would eventually find ways to channel her artistic passions productively. Claire would create her own version of domestic happiness with John, and Eleanor would continue doing what mothers had always done, providing love, guidance, and support while gradually releasing her children to build their own lives. It was both the most difficult and most rewarding work she could imagine, requiring constant adjustments to changing circumstances while maintaining faith in fundamental values that transcended any particular time or place. As the evening light faded into darkness, and the sounds of Millbrook settled into nighttime quiet, Eleanor Hayes felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life she had been privileged to live. Love had indeed proven to be the force that made all other sacrifices worthwhile, connecting her family across any distance or difficulty, and providing strength for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The circle of love that had begun with her marriage to Thomas now encompassed daughters and future sons-in-law, extending outward into a community of relationships that would continue growing and evolving long after Eleanor herself was gone. This was the true inheritance. She would leave behind not material wealth, but the understanding that love expressed through daily acts of service and sacrifice was the foundation upon which all meaningful life was built. Outside, autumn wind rustled through the maple trees, carrying the promise of winter and eventual spring. Inside, the Hayes family continued their evening routines, secure in the knowledge that whatever changes lay ahead, they would meet them together, strengthened by bonds that neither time nor circumstance could entirely break.